Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are once again back looking at the suggestions passed to the developers in January of 2020, and after having a look through the aviation stuff, the naval stuff, and the ground stuff, it's time to push on and have a look at the mechanics parts. And it's kind of cool that we have some very much nice little game improvements talked about here, so let's get started with them. The first one is from Edwin Hubble, and Edwin Hubble is asking for a very simple suggestion: make airfields feel more lively. One of the problems that Edwin has found that in realistic battles, and he actually talks about historical battles as well, because he seems to be a 6-year veteran as well, you know, talking about how, if you didn't know, if you're, I don't know, new to the game, or, you know, been in the game for not 6 years, realistic battles used to be called historical battles, and then they started adding in a lot of alternative history battles, and it didn't really make a lot of sense to keep the name historical battles, so it was changed to realistic battles to more fit the mode. On top of this as well, he talks about how the airfields just feel empty. There isn't a lot going on, there isn't a lot of movement in it, there isn't a ton of stuff, and for him, he even says, now some maps where there's smaller airstrips, like on some of the Pacific theme maps, these are okay, but airfields with larger maps such as Krinz, Berlin, Korea, and Port Novo, they feel desolate. And he talks about adding some static aircraft or infantry to the airfields to make them actually feel alive, and also maybe just putting in some other stuff such as themed vehicles. So if you have a Soviet airfield or you are in a Soviet aircraft, why not have a bunch of Soviet vehicles around you to make it, you know, make a bit more sense. I've always liked the idea of having hangars around on airfields which are filled with planes, you know, which they don't have to do anything, they just have to be there. And then on certain test drive maps we have stuff like trains going around airfields, which is really cool to see. If you play the lower tier Soviet aircraft test drive, you'll actually, if you go over to the left, see a train going by. That would be really nice to see on certain maps. Maybe you have a few jeeps going around like you have on the American test drive map. There's so many nice and interesting opportunities that hopefully will be branched out into Air Realistic and also Sim EC to try and actually just make things feel like they're going on instead of everything being stagnant and not a lot going on. The next one is from Corsair Jazzcat, and he's talking about a top tier suggestion. This one would be a addition of thermal identification plates, panels, and tape. And this is something I didn't actually know existed, so it was actually kind of nice to read through this. So according to Corsair Jazz here, there are certain vehicles which have thermal identification plates or tapes on them, so you can work out if they're allied or not. And there are certain allied tanks which have these, and historically the Abrams and also certain other vehicles like the Bradley had them. So you can see the normal Abrams here, and then you can see the Bradley here, and if you look at the thermal imaging, it actually shows the markers, so that is absolutely cool. It's a really nice, interesting thing, and for me personally, it would be nice to see, because it would actually just kind of show you if the vehicle, what you're looking at, is, you know, I suppose more realistic or more historical in a way. So I would love to see this idea in the game. It obviously won't affect too much, because, you know, most of the time when you're looking at a white blob, you just point and shoot, and you can generally tell what you're shooting at. But having these nice little tidbits added to the game, I think would be a positive influence. The next one is from Black Flagger, and what he is asking for is more options for fuel. It is very obvious that there is a lot of vehicles in the game which do not have very nice fuel options. Black Flagger actually talks about the fact that you have something like the CL-13 where it has, you know, either like 6 minutes of fuel or 20 minutes of fuel, and it seems like a lot of the time you have either too little fuel or too much fuel, depending on what map you're on and what engagement you're in. And since you only have a certain amount of fuel options, there isn't really a lot that you can, you know, kind of screw with. Generally, I personally take around 20 minutes of fuel, but even then, sometimes that's too much, sometimes that's too little, and there's nothing I can can actually do about that because of the fact that the other fuel options are just way too much. He gives examples such as the TU-14T, where you have a minimum load of 29 minutes and a full tank of 1 hour 37. I mean, the majority of the time, if not all of the time, you're never going to take any of these options because they're just way too much. So it would be much better to have more fuel options which were lower than 29 minutes. Then you have the F9, F2, which is in a similar situation, the CL13, which is in the opposite situation, where there isn't a middle point, only 6 minutes and 20 minutes. The big one for me, if I wanted to actually discuss it, would be some of the bombers, and that is some that he's brought up as well. You can see with the Grief, the HE177A5, you either get a minimum load of 1 hour 34 or a full tank of 5 hours 13. Both of these are way too much in War Thunder, even in simulator. And then you got the Hunter F1, which doesn't have a middling ground, only either 5 minutes or 19 minutes, and the TU4, once again, with crazy high fuel tanks, or crazy high fuel loads. So there is obviously a lot of vehicles which have these fuel loads which have been in the game for ages and they haven't been changed that much, and what Black Flagger actually wants is a system where you would be able to either select minute by minute what you could take. So if you want to take 30 minutes, you could take 30 minutes, or 29, 28, 27, whatever you want to go to. Or he would be fine with a compromise if it was every 2 minutes or even every 3 minutes. So if you could pick 3 or 6 or 9 minutes of fuel to take, or 12 or 15, he would be completely fine with that. And yes, that would be a better system than we have in the game right now. It would mean that there would be more player choice, which in my opinion is always good when it comes to playing these vehicles, and on top of it as well, you could tailor your flight characteristics and your fuel load to whatever map that you're on a little bit better than the current system. I personally have always been in favor of a fuel slider, so you could pretty much just pick how much fuel you wanted out of the total amount, and this would pretty much be similar to what he said, where you can select minute by minute of the fuel there. So yeah, I think this is a good idea. It would be lovely to see in the game, and as proven by some of these examples, some of the fuel loads just do not fit the game, and they either need to be looked at or just implement a slider to help out with the system. The next post is from General Omar Bradley, or Gen Omar Bradley, and it's talking about the idea of adding external fuel tanks to machines, the vehicles that he actually uses. And one thing to actually note, all of these posts are actually from 2019. So a lot of these, actually yes, all of them are actually from the second part of 2019, apart from the first one, which is from May of 2019. So yeah, everything is from either September, October, or May of last year. So these are pretty, recent posts. So don't think that, if you put through suggestions now, they'll only get passed in a few years' time. Think about it how these guys, some of their suggestions have only been around for a couple of months and they're already passed through. So that should give you some impetus, to go out there, to put forward your ideas and get them passed on to the developers. But Omar is talking about here the addition of Mach 2 aircraft, certain things such as the F-4C Phantom II and also the MiG-21 F-13. And the way that he sees it, alongside another vehicle, the Chinese J-72, is most of these aircraft, especially the MiG-21s, have a fatal flaw. They have a low fuel amount and very high fuel consumption. So since both of these aircraft, in the form of the Phantom II and the F-13, are classed as interceptors, they don't need too much of a high fuel amount. But what would happen in War Thunder is, because you don't have massive fuel amounts and because you're pushing your afterburner hard a lot of the time, you run out of fuel incredibly quickly. This means that you have a very short time to actually dogfight in the air, meaning that battles don't really get elongated for a very long time. And it also means if they do get elongated, people are going to have to go back and forth to their base and back and forth to refuel fuel, and that means that they are open to being strafed. And one of the problems, at least for me when I play top tier, is whenever I go to land, there is always a person just sitting 5k away from the airfield waiting for somebody to land, and then he or she goes to strafe the person on the airfield because it's an easy kill and you don't even have to try. So that is definitely an issue which I see in the game, and this hopefully would actually solve that. The idea overall is just to add external fuel tanks to the machines to be able to last longer in the air, and also to be able to have a situation where you just have more opportunities to last longer, not just in realistic but also in simulator if you are going ground attacking or base bombing or whatever you're doing. And obviously taking the external fuel tanks would give you a little bit of a performance loss, but at the same time you could stay around. You could stay around for a longer time. You could also jettison the fuel tanks if you wanted to. And pretty much how he wants it to work here is as simple as this, as you can see it's outlined. So equipping an external fuel tank can also have another disadvantage, where if an enemy aircraft strikes the fuel tank with their cannon, it would have a chance to catch fire, increasing the chance of your aircraft catching fire. But if this does happen, you will have the ability to jettison your fuel tanks, which allow your aircraft to be faster and more maneuverable if need be. And then he explains how the mechanic would work for the external fuel tank. When your internal fuel reserves are about to deplete, the fuel will automatically transfer from the external tanks to your internal tanks, increasing your flight time. So pretty much what would happen there is, your internal fuel tanks would be used first, and then your externals would be pushed onto. That is generally how he wants it to work, and I think that's a pretty good way of doing it. It might leave some situations where you jettison the externals and you have absolutely no fuel at all, but that is a chance that you have to take. The last one is from Hey It's Adam, and he is talking about an updated animation when it comes to the muzzle flash that we have on guns. Generally, I don't think they've actually been changed too much for a lot of years when it comes to the muzzle flash, and they are pretty unrealistic if you want to, have a look at it. He actually quotes the Kiwi from this and says, "A muzzle flash's visibility is dependent on atmospheric and lighting conditions, as well as the amount of leftover burning particles. Most of the time, gunfire has no visible muzzle blast in the daytime." And so that's obviously an issue when it comes to the realistic aspect of War Thunder. You can see a lot of flashes for a lot of guns all the time, and yes, it is kind of useful if an enemy is going after you because you can see when it's shooting, but at the same time it is pretty unrealistic. And then he pushes on and says, "A more realistic muzzle blast could work similar to engine exhaust flames, sporadic, relatively small, and barely visible during bright lighting conditions. The game already creates a small smoke stream when aircraft guns are fired." And so you could just make it a little bit more realistic by changing the animations around when guns are fired, and overall that would make it more realistic, and also it would make it just look a little bit nicer, which is always good. And there's even some examples here of guns which are firing and the effect that they create on top of them. So just like a bunch of other quality of life changes that we've had recently, stuff like the sparks, even in the past you have the engine flames which were talked about. Why not have another one which just makes the general look of guns when they're fired look a little bit nicer? It's always nice to see little graphical updates, even though overall, they don't really make too much difference to the overall game. It's a really nice quality of life improvement to see, and as a person who enjoys that stuff, it would be lovely to have. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Daniel Stanton, Jay Wilt, John Ryman, Martinez, Moxie, Super Cacti, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, and also Elove Goat and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.